November 19, 1944, the Lorraine region of eastern France. German anti-tank crews manning defensive positions near the village of Bugaltroff prepared to engage advancing American armor. For 3 consecutive days, these Wehrmacht gunners had exchanged fire with a specific American tank unit, and the experience contradicted every assumption their military training had provided about racial capability in modern warfare. Through magnified optics, Obergefreiter Schmidt, a composite representing numerous German after-action reports from this period, observed the lead Sherman tank of the approaching column. Despite visible combat damage and mechanical stress indicated by smoke trails, the vehicle maintained its advance under direct fire. The tank commander, clearly identifiable as an African-American soldier, remained exposed in the turret operating the Browning M2 .50 caliber machine gun despite the tactical vulnerability of this position. This was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, a 761st Tank Battalion platoon sergeant from Tecumseh, Oklahoma, though German intelligence would not identify him by name until post-war historical research cross-referenced Wehrmacht records with American unit documentation. Medical reports would later document that Rivers had sustained a severe leg wound 3 days prior, a laceration to the femur that had become gangrenous. Despite this combat injury that would typically require immediate evacuation under standard U.S. Army medical protocols, Rivers had declined morphine administration, refused medical transport, assumed command of a replacement vehicle, and continued combat operations. If you appreciate evidence-based military history that examines primary source documentation, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment indicating where you're watching from. We have viewers across 6 continents. The tactical situation Rivers faced represented the culmination of 183 days of continuous combat operations that would ultimately demonstrate the complete invalidity of Nazi racial ideology when confronted with empirical battlefield performance. What Schmidt and his Wehrmacht comrades witnessed in those final moments before Rivers' tank was destroyed would fundamentally challenge their understanding of racial hierarchy, not through ideological argument, but through undeniable combat effectiveness. The so-called inferior soldiers, described in German military training materials, were demonstrating tactical proficiency and personal courage that exceeded the performance benchmarks Schmidt had observed across 5 years of European warfare, including campaigns in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. The 761st Tank Battalion's entry into World War II combat represented more than the deployment of another American armored unit. It constituted a direct collision between 2 fundamentally incompatible worldviews: Nazi Germany's state-mandated racial hierarchy and the combat potential of African-American soldiers operating within a segregated military structure. The battalion adopted "come out fighting" as its official motto, a phrase carrying dual significance that German forces would comprehend through direct experience from November 1944 through May 1945. The unit participated in its initial combat engagement at the Belgian municipality of Morville-le-Vicq on November 7, 1944, maintaining continuous frontline operations through the European War's conclusion. However, their struggle encompassed 2 distinct conflicts. Wehrmacht forces preparing defensive positions against the 761st included personnel who had received systematic indoctrination in racial superiority theories since the Hitler Youth programs of the 1930s. German military training documentation, now housed in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, explicitly stated that soldiers of African descent lacked the cognitive capacity to operate mechanically complex weapons systems, possessed insufficient courage for sustained combat, and would retreat when first engaged by enemy fire. These assessments were not informal prejudices, but formalized doctrinal assumptions that influenced German tactical planning and unit expectations. The 761st would spend 183 consecutive days in combat operations systematically disproving each of these assumptions through documented tactical performance. The 761st Tank Battalion was officially constituted on March 15, 1942, and activated on April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. According to declassified War Department memoranda from this period, The activation decision resulted not from progressive military policy, but from what internal documents characterized as political necessity to maintain Negro morale during wartime mobilization. The battalion's progression to combat deployment differed substantially from comparable white armored units. Personnel assigned to the 761st underwent nearly 24 months of training, while War Department records indicate that white tank battalions typically deployed to combat theaters after 12 to 16 weeks of instruction. This extended training period occurred because African American soldiers recognized that any individual error would be attributed not to personal performance, but to racial capability as a whole, a burden white soldiers did not carry. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, the white officer assigned as battalion commander, accepted a position that military peers considered career-ending. Officers who commanded African American units during this period typically faced professional marginalization within the segregated army structure. However, Bates had served in the American Expeditionary Forces during World War I, where he had observed French colonial troops, including units from Senegal and Morocco, perform with distinction during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive of 1918. More significantly, Bates evaluated personnel based on tactical competence rather than racial classification. After 24 months of intensive training, his official assessment stated that the 761st constituted the best trained tank battalion in the United States Army, a judgment that subsequent combat performance would validate. Among the soldiers who would prove Bates's assessment accurate was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, a farm worker from Oklahoma who stood 6 feet 2 inches tall. Bates's evaluation reports described Rivers as possessing intuitive understanding of terrain analysis and small unit tactics. The battalion also included Warren G.H. Creasy, who would earn the nickname Iron Man through extraordinary combat endurance documented in unit after-action reports. The battalion's most famous member never deployed to Europe. First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson, later known as Jackie Robinson, served with the 761st during training at Camp Hood, Texas. In July 1944, Robinson refused a bus driver's order to move to the rear section of a segregated military transport vehicle. Battalion Commander Bates declined to endorse court-martial charges submitted by military police. The post commander subsequently transferred Robinson to the 758th Tank Battalion, whose commander was willing to sign the insubordination charges. Robinson faced court-martial, but was acquitted on all charges. However, the legal proceedings prevented his deployment with the 761st to Europe. He received an honorable discharge in November 1944 and would break Major League Baseball's color barrier in 1947, but his military service with the 761st represents a lesser-known chapter in his biography. Following 2 years of training in Texas, the 761st Tank Battalion received deployment orders on June 9, 1944, 3 days after Allied forces established beachheads in Normandy during Operation Overlord. The battalion crossed the Atlantic Ocean aboard the British troopship Esperance Bay, arriving in England on September 8, 1944. After brief staging in England, the 761st landed in France via Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944. The unit was immediately attached to Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr.'s Third Army, which was conducting offensive operations across eastern France toward the German frontier. Patton's initial skepticism regarding African-American tank crews is well documented in his personal correspondence. Letters to his wife, now archived at the Library of Congress, expressed doubt about whether black soldiers could think fast enough for armored warfare, a phrase that reflects the racial assumptions prevalent among senior American officers during this period. However, on October 28, 1944, Patton delivered a formal address to the assembled battalion. According to unit records and multiple witness accounts, Patton stated, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you." Their speech, while containing the crude language typical of Patton's command style, represented a pragmatic military assessment. Patton's Third Army required effective armored units to maintain its operational tempo, and he had reviewed the 761st's training records before their attachment to his command. On November 7, 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion engaged in its first combat action, attacking the German-occupied town of Morville-lès-Vicq, Belgium, in support of the 26th Infantry Division. German defenders consisted of Wehrmacht infantry and anti-tank units who, according to post-war interrogation reports, expected minimal resistance from what German intelligence had characterized as America's inferior troops. The engagement lasted approximately 4 hours. During urban combat inside the town, the lead tank commanded by Sergeant Samuel King was disabled by a German Panzerfaust, a shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon. 2 crew members sustained wounds. Fellow tankers extracted them to covered positions behind the disabled vehicle, then eliminated the German soldier who had fired the Panzerfaust. German after-action reports from this engagement, discovered in Wehrmacht archives during post-war research, noted exceptional tactical proficiency displayed by the attacking tank unit. German commanders had anticipated panic and withdrawal when the first American tank was destroyed. Instead, the 761st executed coordinated assault tactics that systematically neutralized German defensive positions. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, commanding another tank in the assault, encountered a German roadblock that halted his vehicle's advance. Under sustained small arms fire from German infantry positions, Rivers exited his tank, attached a tow cable from his M4 Sherman to the roadblock obstacle, returned to the tank and used his vehicle to physically remove the obstruction, thereby allowing the tank column to resume its advance and capture the town. This action resulted in Rivers receiving the Silver Star for gallantry, the first of numerous decorations the battalion would earn, though many awards would be denied or downgraded due to racial prejudice, only to be issued decades later after historical review. November 1944 saw the 761st engaged in continuous combat operations. The unit maintained 183 days of consecutive operational employment, a duration that exceeded standard rotation practices for American armored units. The 761st sustained 156 casualties during November 1944. 24 soldiers killed in action, 81 wounded, and 44 non-battle losses, including illness and non-combat injuries. The unit also lost 14 tanks to combat damage, requiring evacuation to depot-level maintenance facilities, with an additional 20 vehicles damaged but repairable at battalion level. These statistics, while quantifying material and personnel losses, do not adequately convey what German forces were learning through direct combat experience. The African-American tank crews, whom German intelligence had predicted would flee at first contact, were instead maintaining an operational tempo that exceeded most white American armored units. While typical tank battalions received rotation to rear areas after 10 to 14 days of continuous frontline service, the 761st would remain in combat operations for more than 6 months. German intelligence reports from this period, housed in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, begin showing confusion about the identity and capabilities of these tank units. One report from the 11th Panzer Division states, "Enemy tank unit operating in Sector 7 displays exceptional vehicle maintenance standards and aggressive tactical maneuvers inconsistent with intelligence assessments." This represents German military recognition that their assumptions about racial capability in armored warfare were demonstrably incorrect when confronted with actual combat performance. The most dramatic demonstration of the 761st's determination occurred during the assault on the French town of Goebling. On November 16, 1944, while advancing toward Goebling, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank struck an anti-tank mine at a railroad crossing. The explosion caused severe injury to his left leg. Medical documentation describes a laceration extending to the femoral bone. Despite this wound, Rivers declined morphine administration, which would have impaired his combat effectiveness, and refused medical evacuation. He assumed command of a replacement tank and continued advancing with Company A into Goebling. The following day, Captain David Williams, Rivers' company commander, issued multiple direct orders for Rivers to evacuate to Battalion Aid Station. Rivers' response documented in Williams's after-action report, was, "Captain, you know better than that. This is going to be tough. Another 2 days won't make any difference." A battalion medical corpsman who examined Rivers' leg observed severe swelling and infection indicators. According to witness statements, the medic announced, "Listen, he's got gangrene," a potentially fatal bacterial infection requiring immediate surgical intervention. However, before Williams could respond, German artillery fire forced American forces to seek cover, preventing Rivers' evacuation. On November 19, 1944, at dawn, Company A's tanks advanced toward Bulge, their next objective, but were halted by German anti-tank fire. Captain Williams ordered his tanks to withdraw to covered positions. Staff Sergeant Rivers, however, radioed that he had identified the German anti-tank gun positions. His final transmission was, "I see them. We'll fight them." Rivers, accompanied by one other Company A tank, engaged the German anti-tank positions, providing covering fire as Company A withdrew to safer positions. During this action, Rivers' tank was struck by German anti-tank fire, killing Rivers and wounding the surviving crew members. Captain Williams immediately submitted a recommendation for the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest decoration for valor. However, this recommendation would require 52 years for approval, finally being awarded in 1997 after systematic review of World War II decorations revealed racial discrimination in the awards process. December 16, 1944, marked the beginning of Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to American forces as the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final major offensive operation in Western Europe. The 761st was attached to the 87th Infantry Division and immediately deployed to combat the German breakthrough in the Ardennes region. The battalion faced some of Germany's most capable remaining units, including elements of the Führer-Begleit Brigade, an elite formation expanded from Adolf Hitler's personal security battalion. This unit consisted of experienced soldiers equipped with advanced weapons and supported by heavy armor. Combat around the Belgian town of Tillet proved particularly severe. The 761st faced significant challenges in receiving adequate replacement personnel. Declassified War Department documents indicate that replacements were difficult to obtain and that many soldiers assigned to the battalion were raw and untrained or being rejects from other units, totally unfit for duty. Despite receiving inadequate replacement personnel, the 761st maintained combat operations. Unit records describe the fighting as brutal, with the 761st's Sherman tanks and 87th Division Infantry encountering bitter resistance every step of the way. German forces included Tiger tanks, mounting 80mm guns capable of destroying Sherman tanks at ranges where the American 75mm guns could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. The 761st developed tactical countermeasures to compensate for their vehicle's technical inferiority. They utilized superior mobility to conduct flanking maneuvers against heavier German tanks and maintained higher mechanical readiness rates, keeping more vehicles operational compared to German armored units, suffering from fuel shortages and maintenance difficulties. One tanker, Sergeant Frank C. Cochran, transmitted via radio during combat, "They've hit me 3 times, but I'm still giving them hell," a transmission recorded in unit communications logs. By January 9, 1945, Tillet was secured by American forces. The 761st had contributed to halting the German offensive, but sustained heavy casualties in the process. By late April 1945, the 761st would be among the first American battalions to establish contact with Soviet forces advancing from the east. This meeting occurred at Steyr, Austria, in early May 1945. Historical sources vary on the precise date, with documentation indicating either April 26 or May 5 or 6, 1945. Tanker. Leonard Smith described an encounter with a Soviet female tank crew member who approached him shouting, "America, America, America," and embraced him vigorously. Soviet forces, which included women in combat roles, including tank crews, showed no surprise at seeing African-American tankers. For Soviet soldiers, what mattered was that these were fellow soldiers who had survived the brutal fight against Nazi Germany. The 761st Tank Battalion's combat record provides quantifiable evidence of their effectiveness. 183 consecutive days of combat operations from November 7, 1944 to May 6, 1945. Operations across 6 countries: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. Participation in 4 major campaigns: Northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace, and Central Europe. The battalion inflicted approximately 4,000 German casualties, according to National World War II Museum records. They destroyed hundreds of vehicles, 31 pillboxes, 49 machine gun emplacements, and 29 anti-tank guns, and captured substantial numbers of prisoners. Unit casualties approached 50%. The battalion's initial strength consisted of 36 officers, 30 African American and 6 white, plus 676 enlisted men. The unit lost 71 tanks total during combat operations. Awards included 1 Medal of Honor posthumously awarded to Reuben Rivers in 1997, 7 Silver Stars, 70 Bronze Stars, and approximately 246 to 300 Purple Hearts. These decorations represent only official recognition. Many recommendations were denied or downgraded due to racial prejudice, only being properly awarded decades later after systematic review. February and March 1945 saw the 761st participating in assaults against the Siegfried Line, officially known as the West Wall, Germany's final major fortification system along its western frontier. The battalion was attached to the 103rd Infantry Division for this operation. Within several days of initiating the assault, the Siegfried Line was penetrated, and German troops began surrendering in increasing numbers. By March 23, 1945, the 761st had destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles and heavy weapons, inflicted approximately 4,000 casualties, according to records maintained by the National World War II Museum, and captured nearly 4,000 prisoners of war. Combat during this phase differed from operations in France and Belgium. The battalion was now fighting on German soil, facing Wehrmacht and Volkssturm units, the latter consisting of hastily mobilized German civilians, defending their homeland. Yet German soldiers were also surrendering in larger numbers, particularly when they realized they were facing the African American tank crews about whom they had heard reports. Interrogation reports indicate that German prisoners were terrified of capture by Black American soldiers. Years of Nazi propaganda had convinced them that African American troops would be savage and merciless. This fear, based entirely on racist ideology, proved completely unfounded. African American soldiers of the 761st learned to remain inside their tanks until German soldiers approached closely for surrender, because emerging prematurely would allow German troops to identify their race, causing some to panic and flee rather than surrender, thereby prolonging combat unnecessarily. This fear was based on Nazi propaganda, depicting black soldiers as inherently violent. In reality, the 761st treated prisoners according to Geneva Convention protocols, frequently sharing their own rations with captured German soldiers. This professional conduct confused German civilians, who had been taught to expect barbarism from racial inferiors. As the 761st advanced into Germany during March 1945, they encountered scenes revealing the Nazi regime's true nature. German civilians, conditioned by years of racial propaganda, feared African American soldiers. Many fled rather than remain in areas occupied by the 761st. However, the battalion maintained strict discipline. Unit records contain no documented cases of reprisals against civilians, looting, or revenge attacks, despite the racial hatred these soldiers knew German civilians had been taught. This professional conduct confused German civilians who had expected racial inferiors to behave like the savages depicted in Nazi propaganda. Tank combat continued as the 761st pushed deeper into Germany, facing Panther and Tiger tanks, as well as desperate resistance from Waffen-SS units. Warren G.H. Creasy, who had earned his Iron Man nickname through extraordinary combat endurance, proved particularly notable during this period. He frequently dismounted his tank at night, carrying an M1 Garand rifle to conduct personal reconnaissance missions, actions documented in unit records as providing valuable intelligence for subsequent operations. One of the 761st Tank Battalion's most significant moments occurred on May 65, 1945, when the unit liberated Gunskirchen concentration camp in Austria. The camp held approximately 15,000 Hungarian Jews in various stages of starvation. SS guards had fled days earlier, abandoning prisoners to die. The scene confronting the African-American tankers defied adequate description. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, many unable to stand, filled the camp. Technician 5th grade Johnny Stevens later stated in an oral history interview, "Here were people who looked like skeletons, trying to smile, trying to wave. Some of them were crying. We gave them everything we had, our rations, our chocolate, everything." The symbolism was profound. Nazi Germany's supposed racial inferiors were liberating victims of racial hatred. Sonja Schreiber-Weitz, a 17-year-old woman liberated by the unit, later wrote a poem titled "The Black Messiah," describing her liberation. "A black GI stood by the door. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die. I thought he must be the Messiah." While specific Wehrmacht documents explicitly mentioning the 761st by unit designation are limited in surviving archives, German reactions to African-American combat troops are extensively documented in military records and prisoner interrogations housed in American and German archives. One surrendering German officer asked American interrogators, "How many Negro Panzer divisions are there?" When informed there was only one battalion, he refused to believe it. The continuous presence of the 761st over 183 days had created the impression among German forces of a much larger organization. German prisoners repeatedly expressed surprise at the combat effectiveness of black troops. Interrogation reports from 1945, now housed in the National Archives, document German soldiers struggling to reconcile observed combat performance with Nazi racial ideology. One captured Wehrmacht sergeant told interrogators, "We were told the Negroes would run at the first shot. Instead, they kept coming even when we knocked out their tanks. This was not what we expected." The war in Europe concluded on May 8, 1945, but the 761st struggle continued in a different form. Like white veterans, African-American tankers struggled with combat trauma and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Unlike white soldiers, however, black veterans returned to segregation and violent racial prejudice throughout much of the United States. Staff Sergeant Floyd Dade Jr., a Texas native, described the contradictions facing black veterans in an oral history interview. "We didn't have equal rights. Democracy was against us." The men who had destroyed German tanks and liberated concentration camps returned to an America where they could not eat in many restaurants, were required to sit in rear sections of buses, and faced violent racism. German prisoners of war held in the United States were frequently treated better than the African-American soldiers who had captured them, a historical irony documented in War Department records regarding POW camp operations. For 33 years, the 761st Tank Battalion's achievements went officially unrecognized at the unit level. Individual medals were awarded, but the presidential unit citation that white battalions received immediately after the war was denied to the 761st. This changed on January 24, 1978, when President Jimmy Carter awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st. The citation stated, "The 761st Tank Battalion distinguished itself by extraordinary gallantry, courage, professionalism, and high esprit de corps displayed in the accomplishment of unusually difficult and hazardous operations." Ultimate recognition came in 1997 when 7 members of the battalion, including Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, posthumously received the Medal of Honor. The award ceremony occurred on January 12, 1997. President Clinton noted, "No African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for his service in World War II received it at the time. Today, we fill the gap in that picture and give a group of heroes who also loved peace but adapted themselves to war the tribute that has always been their due." One significant transformation involved General Patton himself. Despite initial skepticism about black soldiers' capabilities, Patton's assessment changed dramatically through the 761st service. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German soldiers who had raided American supply depots were reported to be disguising themselves as Americans at checkpoints to conduct ambushes, Patton ordered black soldiers, including the 761st, to guard these checkpoints with orders to shoot any white soldiers acting suspiciously. This order demonstrated remarkable trust. Patton was placing the security of his entire army in the hands of black soldiers he had once doubted could think fast enough for armored warfare. By war's end, Patton had recommended the 761st for numerous commendations. While his personal racial views remained complex and problematic, his military assessment of the battalion was unequivocal. They were among his best units. Ironically, the racism that kept the 761st training for 2 years, instead of the standard 12-16 weeks, became their greatest advantage. The extended training period meant that when the 761st finally entered combat, they were arguably the best prepared tank battalion in the US Army. They could perform complete maintenance procedures in total darkness, had memorized every aspect of their tank's operation, and had developed unit cohesion that only comes from extended time training together. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates later testified that the delay in sending them to combat, which was wrong and racist, accidentally created the best-trained tank battalion in the Army. They could do things with Shermans that shouldn't have been possible. While Reuben Rivers received the most recognition, Warren G. H. Cressy's combat record deserves particular attention. Known as Iron Man, Cressy survived the entire war despite being wounded multiple times and destroying extraordinary amounts of German equipment. During one engagement, when Cressy's tank was disabled by German fire, instead of withdrawing, he assumed control of a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a half-track and used it to provide covering fire for his crew's escape while simultaneously destroying the German position. Cressy frequently volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, leading reconnaissance missions on foot, behind enemy lines. He survived the war, but like many veterans, struggled with what would now be recognized as PTSD. He rarely spoke about his experiences, and it wasn't until the 1978 Presidential Unit citation that his extraordinary service received proper recognition. One aspect of 761st service that surprised German forces was their mechanical proficiency. Nazi propaganda had insisted that black soldiers lacked the capability to operate complex machinery. Instead, the 761st maintained one of the highest operational readiness rates in Third Army. This resulted partly from extended training, but also from the dedication of soldiers like Technician 5th Grade William Harvey, who could diagnose engine problems acoustically. The battalion's maintenance crews worked through nights, often under enemy fire, to keep tanks operational. German reports expressed confusion at seeing damaged Sherman tanks they had assessed as permanently destroyed, reappearing days later, fully operational. The 761st's ability to maintain vehicles under combat conditions exceeded that of many veteran Wehrmacht units. Facing superior German tanks like Tigers and Panthers, whose 80 mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where American 75 mm guns couldn't penetrate German armor. The 761st developed innovative tactics they termed cat hunting. One Sherman would act as bait, drawing fire and revealing German positions. 2 additional tanks would then maneuver to flanking positions, engaging the thinner side and rear armor of German heavy tanks. This required extraordinary coordination and courage. The bait tank was frequently destroyed. These tactics were studied and adopted by other American armored units, and the 761st's combat innovations contributed to overall improvement of American armored doctrine in the European theater. During the Battle of the Bulge, the 761st played a crucial role in relieving the encircled 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. While Patton's relief of Bastogne is well documented in military history, the 761st's role is frequently overlooked. Fighting through severe winter conditions, with temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the battalion helped penetrate German lines. They faced not just regular Wehrmacht units, but also Waffen-SS formations, making desperate attempts to maintain the encirclement. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and critically low on supplies and ammunition, observed as 761st Sherman tanks broke through German lines. One paratrooper later recalled in an oral history interview, "We didn't care what color they were. They were the most beautiful sight we'd ever seen." The 761st produced exceptional combat leaders. Captain Irvin McHenry, Captain John Long and Lieutenant Charles Barber, all demonstrated tactical competence under fire documented in after-action reports. These African-American officers commanded through earned respect and demonstrated ability, rather than merely formal military hierarchy. Captain David Williams, commanding Company A, submitted more Medal of Honor recommendations for his soldiers than any other company commander in the battalion. Most were administratively downgraded or denied due to racial prejudice, only receiving proper recognition decades later after systematic historical review. The 761st's success resulted partly from exceptional cooperation with infantry units. Despite initial prejudice from white infantry formations, the tankers' combat performance quickly earned respect. During the assault on Kleimbach, France, white infantrymen specifically requested 761st support, having observed their effectiveness in previous engagements. The battalion's consistent willingness to provide close support, often at great risk, saved substantial infantry casualties. One infantry sergeant wrote in a letter home, later donated to military archives, "The colored tank boys saved our bacon more times than I can count. They'd drive right into German fire to give us cover. I don't care what anyone says back home. These men are heroes." The 761st's aggressive combat approach was reflected in ammunition consumption. They expended over 300 tons of ammunition during their deployment, an extraordinary amount for a single battalion. This wasn't wasteful fire, but sustained, accurate engagement, reflecting extensive training. German after-action reports frequently noted the accuracy of American tank fire in sectors where the 761st operated. As casualties mounted, the 761st faced a unique problem. The segregated army maintained limited numbers of trained African-American tank crew replacements. Unit records note that many of the new men assigned to join the Black Panthers were raw and untrained, or being rejects from other units totally unfit for duty. This meant experienced crew members couldn't be rotated to rear areas for rest. Exhausted soldiers continued fighting because no trained replacements existed. This contributed to both extraordinary heroism and high casualty rates documented in medical records. The 761st's presence created problems for German propaganda. Soldiers who had faced them couldn't reconcile their combat experience with official Nazi racial theory. Wehrmacht morale reports from early 1945, archived in German military collections, note increasing skepticism about racial propaganda among troops who had engaged Black American units. German soldiers were questioning, if the racial theory is true, why are we losing to inferior races? This cognitive dissonance contributed to collapsing fighting spirit in many German units during the war's final months, a factor noted in Wehrmacht High Command assessments. Before deployment, the 761st had trained in the American South under Jim Crow segregation. Most training occurred at installations in Kentucky, Louisiana, and Texas. Before civil rights advances of the 1960s, Black Americans faced severe discrimination in the South and were considered inferior by many white residents. At Camp Hood, Texas, they encountered constant racial harassment. Local businesses refused service. Military buses enforced segregation. The battalion was housed in the worst section of the base near sewage treatment facilities. Yet this adversity forged extraordinary unit cohesion. The men of the 761st understood they were fighting two wars, one against Germans, another against racism. This dual purpose provided determination that German forces couldn't comprehend or overcome. The 761st's most famous member was First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson, later known as Jackie Robinson. During training, a white bus driver ordered Robinson to move to the rear of a segregated bus. Robinson refused and was arrested. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates refused to endorse court-martial charges submitted by military police. The post commander transferred Robinson to the 758th Tank Battalion, whose commander was willing to sign insubordination charges. Robinson faced court-martial, but was acquitted on all charges. However, legal proceedings meant he missed the 761st's deployment to Europe. He received honorable discharge in November 1944 and would break baseball's color barrier in 1947. On November 10, 2005, a monument to the 761st Tank Battalion was unveiled at Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos, Texas. The monument features 4 black granite tablets surrounding a life-size marble sculpture of a 761st soldier kneeling atop a black granite pedestal, engraved with a tank on the front and a panther on the reverse. The dedication was attended by surviving veterans, their families, and military officials. The keynote speaker noted that the 761st had fought not just for victory over Nazi Germany, but for the principle that all Americans, regardless of race, could serve their country with distinction. Perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. In the 1990s, American military historians interviewing former Wehrmacht veterans about tank warfare encountered consistent mentions of exceptional American tank units. When asked to identify these units, German veterans frequently described black tankers who had fought with particular ferocity and skill. These were men who had no reason to praise former enemies, yet they consistently identified the 761st as among the best tank units they had faced. One former German tank commander stated in a recorded interview, "They fought like devils. We couldn't understand why men their own country treated as inferior fought so hard for it. Now I think perhaps that was why. They had something to prove, and they proved it." The human cost of 761st service was severe. With nearly 50% casualties, the battalion paid heavily for their achievements. Families received telegrams informing them that sons, husbands, and fathers had died fighting for a country that didn't grant them full citizenship rights. Yet survivors rarely expressed bitterness about this contradiction. Leonard Smith, who became a New York City transit officer after the war, stated in a 1995 oral history interview, "We knew what we were fighting for was bigger than the prejudice we faced. We were fighting for what America could be, not what it was." For decades, the 761st story remained largely unknown outside the black community. History books, when mentioning black soldiers, typically focused on support units. Combat achievements of units like the 761st were minimized or ignored. This began changing in the 1970s, with the civil rights movement's emphasis on recovering black history. The 1978 Presidential Unit Citation brought national attention. The 1997 Medal of Honor ceremony increased visibility further. Today, the 761st Tank Battalion is recognized as one of the most effective armored units in the European theater. Their story is taught at the U.S. Army Armor School, studied at military academies, and honored in museums. The 761st Tank Battalion's story remains relevant today. It demonstrates that prejudice and discrimination waste human potential. The Army's initial reluctance to employ black soldiers in combat roles nearly deprived it of one of its best tank battalions. It also shows that excellence cannot be suppressed by prejudice. Despite facing discrimination from their own country and deadly hatred from enemies, the 761st achieved extraordinary results through skill, courage, and determination. Their story challenges examination of contemporary prejudices and preconceptions. If Nazi Germany, one of history's most militarily proficient nations, could be catastrophically wrong about racial capabilities, what assumptions made today might be equally false? The 761st's combat record became a powerful argument for military integration. When President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the armed forces, combat achievements of units like the 761st were specifically cited as evidence that segregation weakened military effectiveness. During the Korean War, integrated units performed exceptionally well, validating what the 761st had proven, that competence and courage recognize no racial boundaries. Many 761st veterans served as advisors during this integration process, sharing lessons learned from their unique experience. Individual veterans faced varied post-war experiences. Some, like E.G. McConnell, used the GI Bill to obtain college educations that would have been impossible before the war. Others faced continued discrimination in employment and housing despite their service. Warren Cressy struggled with PTSD, then termed combat fatigue, for years after the war. Like many veterans, he rarely discussed his experiences. It wasn't until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation that many families learned the full extent of their relatives' heroism. The full story of the 761st has been pieced together from various sources: official Army records, German military archives, personal letters and diaries, and oral histories collected decades later. Each source adds details to the picture of extraordinary service under impossible circumstances. The US Army's official history, published in the 1950s, barely mentioned the 761st. Independent historians and the veterans themselves worked to ensure their story was preserved. Today, the National Archives holds extensive records of the battalion's service, available to researchers and the public. The 761st's liberation of Gunskirchen concentration camp is commemorated at Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims. Survivors and their descendants have maintained connections with battalion veterans and their families. In 2015, the Austrian government invited surviving 761st members to ceremonies marking the 70th anniversary of the war's end. They were honored not just as liberators, but as men who had demonstrated humanity amid inhuman circumstances. German Tigers and Panthers never expected the 761st Black Panthers to fight at all, much less for 183 consecutive days without relief. Nazi racial ideology had assured them that black soldiers were incapable of operating tanks, lacked courage, and would flee at first contact. Instead, they encountered men who had trained longer, fought harder, and endured more than almost any other American unit. The 761st didn't just help defeat Nazi Germany. They demolished its racial ideology through undeniable combat excellence. From their first combat engagement until the European War's conclusion, the 761st received 7 Silver Stars, 246 Purple Hearts, and 1 Congressional Medal of Honor. These decorations, many awarded decades late due to racial prejudice, only hint at the full extent of their heroism. The 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 days without relief, not because they weren't exhausted, they were. Not because they didn't suffer casualties, they lost nearly half their personnel. They fought because they carried the hopes and dignity of millions of black Americans who were told they weren't good enough to serve their country in combat. Every Sherman tank they drove into battle carried more than ammunition. It carried the weight of representation, the burden of proof, and the determination to demonstrate that courage and competence know no color. Every German position they destroyed struck a blow not just against the Wehrmacht, but against the racial prejudices of 2 nations, their enemies and their own. German forces that faced them learned a lesson challenging everything they had been taught. The black soldiers they had been told were subhuman proved to be extraordinary humans. The inferior troops demonstrated superior courage. The men who supposedly couldn't operate complex machinery mastered tank warfare at the highest level. In the end, the 761st Tank Battalion's greatest victory wasn't capturing towns or destroying enemy tanks. It was proving beyond doubt, in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, that excellence is not determined by race, but by training, determination, and character. They were the Black Panthers. They came out fighting, and for 183 days without relief against enemies who never expected them to fight at all, they never stopped. Their legacy lives on not just in military history, but in the ongoing struggle for equality and recognition that their sacrifice helped advance. The German Tigers expected easy prey. They found instead the Black Panthers and learned that everything they believed about race and war was catastrophically wrong.